Corporal Flynn O'Donnell, Odie, was hot and itchy. It was high noon on this alien world. That reminded him of Mongolia. There was high grass, rolling hills, lots of open plains and prairie. He had been laying on this hilltop for 6 hours now, and would stay for 6 days if needed. He felt a mild tingling on the front side of his body from the ghillie suit. He had no idea where the name came from. Rumor had it that it was one of the old words from when humans were still earthbound. Ghillie suits were basically color-marked work uniforms with pieces of netting so that indigenous flora could be attached to full observers. Over the ages, ghillie suits have been modified in every conceivable way, with the most successful designs being as low-tech as possible. Modern warfare was geared to sophisticated technology that could outperform or jam sophisticated countermeasures, but every enhancement brought at least 3 weaknesses. The tingling he felt was from a skin suit mesh network that had initially been designed to be a remote diagnostic tool. Having a skin suit that could immediately treat wounds seemed like a great idea, until they realized the user couldn't override treatment, so debilitating narcotics would be administered when the system deemed it necessary, but without patient permission. The treatments had been scalded back more and more, until now the skin suits were almost completely stripped of technology. The tingling was a mild TENS system, causing minute muscle spasms at irregular intervals so his body didn't stiffen. The sensation was halfway between a tickle and an itch. The suit at times had employed various types of holographic technology. The holograms looked great, but had no tangible presence, couldn't adjust to changes in natural lighting, and the shadows weren't right. Count the shadows. That was from an ancient horror story that had terrified him as a child. That bit of wisdom was invaluable when dealing with holograms. With the lack of physical presence of holograms, you would see part of the hologram being blocked by a physical object, but if you watched carefully, the holographic image would suddenly appear whole. So that was another piece of good advice from an old horror story. Don't blink. Boredom was an issue lying here for hours and hours. There had been sophisticated helmets that had HUD displays which could load you with every minute detail of your environment, and even provide entertainment to help you while away the hours. The problems there were the distraction factor and difficulty with information prioritization. If you had entertainment and information feeds to distract you, you were distracted. That seemed excessively redundant and obvious, but it was true. You would be less engaged with your environment. Odie recalled one of the old horror stories where passengers on a transport were all given an excessive plethora of individual entertainment, but the hero of the story had secretly disabled the system, so everyone had to talk to each other. There was a monster disguised as a passenger, which would have easily killed everyone if they had been distracted. But since the monster could only repeat what it had been told, they were able to discover who it was before killing everyone. Ironically, the one it did manage to kill was the hapless employee, who was in charge of providing the entertainment. Odie was pretty sure there was some sort of moral to that story, but wasn't sure what it was. Odie's weapon was the terror of anyone who ever had the bad luck to fight humans. Alien weapons in interstellar races were truly impressive pieces of hardware. There were lasers, phasers, particle projectors, plasma weapons, sonic devices, and endless others. But with sophistication came vulnerability. Delicate electronics could get easily damaged. Dust storms absorb particle projectiles, so your shot would dissipate while you had a clear view of the target. Other weather, especially rain, could be an issue, and all that was before your enemy started using detection and countermeasure technology. Earth Force still trained on and used kinetic firearms. They were sturdy, held up against weather, and were so simple that they were invisible and invulnerable to enemy defensive technology. Odie recalled one of the horror stories where the hero had tried to intimidate the villains by bragging how sophisticated his technology was, and the villain simply reached over, grabbed the object, and broke it with his bare hands. The moral to that story was obvious. Simple is better. More simple equipment also gave the best advantage. The sight to fire the weapon was made by a jeweler company. They specialized in precision sculpting of crystals and lenses. Both their jewelry and their scopes were exquisite works of art. There have been attempts to replace the scopes with electronic versions, but they were physically delicate and easily disabled by an EMP. His helmet did have a radio. That was to be used only in emergencies. Radio signals, even with foolproof encryption, could still help enemies locate sender and receiver. That's why Earth Force snipers learned sign language and relied on hand signals. Odie was watching and waiting for very specific hand signals. The suit netting had undergone several changes over the years, which included various types of protective armoring and climate control, and even artificial replicas of vegetation. The armoring and climate control would make the suit heavier, and occasionally limit movement or functionality. Artificial vegetation never seemed quite right, and there were two people it couldn't fool: avians and the completely colorblind. Many avian species had color sight much better than even human women, being able to see into infrared and ultraviolet spectrums. Artificial and natural non-indigenous flora instantly stood out to them. To the completely colorblind, they only saw shapes, so if the shapes of artificial flora weren't right, it didn't matter how good the color match was. Odie recalled a couple of the old horror stories where women had tried to blend in by imitating local accents, but the result was that they actually stuck out like a sore thumb. Fake is fake, no matter how hard you try. Another advantage of a ghillie suit that used native flora was that it covered your smell. Aliens smelled. Actually, even humans from different regions smelled. The dirt and natural flora in the ghillie suit would absorb your smell, which also helped with concealment. One of the horror stories had human-eating aliens that were easily detectable because they farted repeatedly and pungently. So now, here he was. After thousands of years of intra- and interspecies warfare, the deadliest of human warriors. Invisible. Unstoppable. A nightmare from the corner of your eye. A bald ape wearing plants with a boomstick and endless patience. A bird landed on Odie, pecked at him for a minute, then flew off. It reminded him of another horror story, where a family had been transformed into scarecrows, where they were conscious but undying, simply staring at the field for eternity. He ignored the bird, just watching and waiting. The regiment commander was the scariest motherfucker Odie had ever met. The first time Odie had seen the guy, he was in his clergy robe. It had been completely bare of any adornment. You would have thought that, except for his age, he was just a random novice clergyman. In his robe, everyone simply referred to him as Brother Manuel. He led a service, read scripture, gave communion, and even heard confessions and gave counseling. He was different with confessions. Instead of using booze or text messaging for anonymity, he would sit and talk to the penitent in the chapel pews. This kindly father figure with compassion and wisdom was about as far away from a fearsome warrior as you could imagine. When the robe came off and the uniform was on, the general was the stuff of legends, or nightmares. Odie remembered a poem from one of those horror stories from his childhood, When a Good Man Goes to War. Demons run when a good man goes to war. Night will fall and drown the sun when a good man goes to war. Friendship dies and true love lies. Night will fall and the dark will rise when a good man goes to war. This campaign had been 6 years in the making. All of the intelligence that Earthguff had gathered about their enemies had showed it was going to be a long bloody campaign. Other generals stayed in rear echelon positions, but this general was square in the thick of the fight. Odie had even seen him operating a power suit like it was a second skin, giving young Marines pointers. The general had given him one job: kill the enemy he pointed to. One shot, and done. Odie's second order was to stand down once the general clapped his hands. The general was fearsome because he knew how to surgically use terror. He didn't give prolonged, gruesome, exotic threats, or try to solve everything with a bomb. Instead, he would simply cut the head of the snake. Maury finished his prayer, then pulled out a San Lucas medallion that bore the image of his beloved wife, Elena, He stared at it, softly stroking the tiny face. He kissed the medallion, then tucked it away into his shirt. He stood, straightened his uniform, then walked outside his tent. He left his tent and went to the communications tent. A few humans and several otters were hard at work. Maury was very impressed by the otters. Communications could make or break a campaign, and the greatest disasters had come from errors in communication. But the otters were the finest experts at cooperation that he had ever seen. Where one would leave off, another would take over seamlessly. They seemed to be almost completely devoid of personal egos. When an individual otter was being given an award, he would think it was odd that his teammates also didn't get the award. EarthGov had originally rejected the idea of the diminutive otters being part of Earth Force, because they were almost pacifist by nature. But Maury knew it took more than warriors to win a battle. His beloved wife was a nurse in the Order of San Lucas, and had sacrificed herself so that others could live. Maury was sure she would have liked and appreciated the otters. Maury has studied the enemy commanders. History has shown that the greatest threat was the will to do terrible things. EarthGov had decided to expand into these aliens' territory. While the morality of that decision was highly debatable, Maury's orders were not. Secure the planet by any means necessary. Maury has set up a meeting to parley with the enemy commanders. His counterpart, Svaz, was known for being a bloodthirsty brute. His second-in-command, Zebern, was said to be more of a tactician. Maury's plan would be considered completely amoral and illegal, even though if it was successful, countless lives would be saved. This is one of the many reasons he did not allow embedded journalists. A finger-wagging media diva would not understand why certain decisions were necessary in war. Maury and his aide-de-camp arrived at the edge of the field that was the demilitarized zone. At the far edge of the field, the enemies, Svaz and Zebern, stood. Maury's aide was understandably nervous. He asked, "General, what if they have the same plan that you do?" Maury spoke with determination. "Then we will be with God, and the regiment has his orders." Maury and his aide glanced at each other and nodded, then began walking to the center. Svaz and Zebern also began to walk to the center. Odie watched and waited. The men in the center of the field talked. Svaz thumped his chest. "I am War Commander Svaz, destroyer of worlds. You and your kind shall perish horribly. We have you outnumbered. Our weapons are the mightiest the galaxy has ever seen. We shall obliterate you until not even your gods remember your names. Return to your world before it is too late." Maury responded, "I am General Manuel Oscar Rodriguez Ibanez of United Earth Force. This is my aide, Lieutenant Ashton. Earth has laid claim to this world in accordance with galactic law. Withdraw to the Macrawl system. We are prepared to defend our property." Odie watched and waited. Zebern spoke up. "I am Intelligence Marshal Zebern. We have been studying you humans. We have made it known that we are unbeatable in conflict. We will be willing to negotiate a border boundary, but you cannot defeat us. Our weapon superiority is absolute." He produced a large datapad with a screen that showed devastating destruction from Landran weapons. Maury and his aide watched the screen for a moment. Then Lieutenant Ashton spoke up. "We are aware, but this world belongs to us. We have our orders. Let's negotiate so we can avoid bloodshed." Odie watched and waited. Svaz stamped the ground and shook his fists at the sky, shouting threats. Odie watched and waited. Lieutenant Ashton produced his own datapad, where he called up star charts. Maury casually waved a hand at the screen, showing desired borders and demilitarized zones. Odie watched and waited. Zebern showed more of the devastating weapons and maps of massive fleets. Odie watched and waited. Svaz waved his arms, shrieked threats and obscenities regarding sickening methods of genocide. Maury had Lieutenant Ashton call up the galactic legal code that Earth was using to claim the planet. Odie watched and waited. After several more minutes of this sort of back and forth, Maury took a moment to straighten his cap and uniform jacket. You have been warned. Because you ignore this warning, your blood is on your own hands. Maury pointed at Svaz. Odie squeezed the trigger once. He realigned his sight to Zabern. A pop echoed across the plain. Svaz's head burst, and brown-green blood splattered over Maury, Zabern, and Lieutenant Ashton. Zabern was in horrified shock, while Lieutenant Ashton was visibly shaken. He pulled a cloth from a pocket to wipe the blood from his face and neck. The smell made him nauseated, especially in the afternoon heat. Maury stood like a statue, with his face splattered with Svaz's blood, dripping off his nose and chin. Svaz's body fell, the sound being a solid thud that Odie could swear he actually heard. He remained still, watching and waiting. Maury kept his hand in a pointed gesture, but pointed to the ground. He spoke coldly to Zabern. Your fleet does not matter. Your weapons do not matter. This world is the property of Earth, and we will kill any who oppose us as we did him. This is your only opportunity to surrender and live, or else we will kill you and your people. Or Trevez, or Trevez, or Trevez. Zabern was weak with terror. No, it wasn't supposed to be this way. You were supposed to see it was impossible and go home. We never intended to fight. Maury stood like a statue. Explain. Zabern was sweating, or something like it. A yellow-green liquid oozed from ridges on his face. We have seen what humans are like in war. Your insatiable bloodlust is well known. We have read reports of your internal conflicts with countless unspeakable crimes against your own kind. And that's why we fabricated the intelligence about our military capabilities. We hope to scare you off. He looked down at Svaz's corpse, still bleeding. This was never supposed to happen. Maury raised his straight arm, so now he was pointing to the ground at a 45-degree angle. As I said, this is your one opportunity. Unconditional surrender and you will live. Do you agree? Odie watched and waited. Zabern visibly slumped. His body wavered. Lieutenant Ashton had to resist the urge to reach out and steady him. He said quietly, We surrender. Maury wasn't done. And? Zabern took a deep breath. We surrender unconditionally. Maury raised his hands over his head, clapped twice and shouted, Volodos! And there it was. Odie's wait was over. He still watched, looking in and out of the scope and shifting his body slightly. Moving felt good. Zabern looked around in terror as over 24 human soldiers in ghillie suits unmelted from the terrain and stood up, weapons at the ready. Many were inside the demilitarized zone, with the closest being only 3 meters away. Zabern's knees buckled and Lieutenant Ashton did catch him this time. Maury told him, Tell your people to stand down. Her forces are on the way to take them into custody. Everyone who surrenders will be unharmed. Zabern radioed his troops, giving the order to surrender. Lieutenant Ashton's datapad had an otter from the communications platoon on screen, verifying the deployment of Air Force troops to take the enemy into custody. Once the operation was underway, Odie received a message over his helmet. Maury was pointing at him. O'Donnell, show yourself! Odie stood up. Zabern squinted, then used the small binoculars that Lieutenant Ashton loaned him to see Odie. He glanced in and out of the binoculars, stunned at the distance. Maury informed him, That is the man who took out Svaz. We have many such snipers. It is good that you chose life today.